their own collection of books at a young age. And family reunions, this is a book from the Field Steplight family reunion. And I'll just pass it around, you can flip through there. And then this is another handout, and it shows the family tree of the Steplights. So how many people have seen their family tree? Somebody in the family has written out their family tree. Okay, so a few people. All right. Are any of you the authors of the family tree or the keepers of the family tree? You are? You keeper. This book, The Promised Land, it's called The Promised Land, The Great Black Migration and How It Changed America by Nicholas Lehman. And one of the passages speaks to that issue of people not being willing to share information. And I want to share with you one of the passages. It says, the family history as Ruby heard it was sketchy. Her grandfather's grandmother had been a slave whose last name was Chambers, but she was sold to a white family named Hopkins, who changed her name to match theirs. Shortly afterward, according to family legend, she had given birth to a white-looking child whose father was the master. This child was Ruby's great-grandfather. Quite often in those days, poor black families in the South didn't pass on to their children too much information about slavery because they considered it an unpleasant memory and one that might induce a lack of self-esteem if dwelt upon at length. Many people of Ruby's generation were left with a vague picture of horrors, whippings, sales that broke up families, sexual oppression, material privation, and a feeling that you were better off not knowing the details, so long as you were aware that things were better now. And so my father was born in 1929, so now he's about 83 years old. And he doesn't talk much. He came from Mississippi. He attended Alcorn. And it's very interesting. One of the books I started reading, Homelands and Borderways, talks about Alcorn University and how it was named after the founder of Alcorn. So I didn't know that history. But it talked about how the Klan burned down the land that this man Alcorn gave for the university to be established, for the college to be established. The Klan burned it down because they didn't want an institution of education to be built and created to educate the people of color, the black people. And so I think about that, and I think about how little that my own father shares, and it just makes me think of, well, what did he go through as a man, as a black man in Mississippi, that he really doesn't want to look back. And the only time he ever went back to Mississippi was when his mother passed. So he never went back any other time. And so for us, that when you're doing genealogy work and you're dealing with people and you're wondering, why don't they talk? Why don't they share the information? Why won't they tell us? And sometimes that's the reason, because they had such a painful experience that they don't want to look back, they don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to share it with their children and their grandchildren. And so that's something that we have to be aware of as we do the research and try to get the information from other relatives who know bits and pieces, and you try to get the family history, or I try to get my father's history that way by talking to my cousins who grew up in Mississippi and so who know more, or talking a little bit to his sister, who's his last surviving sibling. Now on my mom's side are the Steplights, and Alfonso Brown is the family historian, and he works in Charleston, and he runs Gullah tours, because in the Charleston area we have the Gullah Geechee culture, because when African people were brought over to Charleston and then they were sent to the Sea Islands to work, they were able to retain their culture in terms of beliefs, values, and traditions, because they were in such a remote area on the islands and pretty much left to themselves. And I just want to share with you something that he wrote for our family. He says, the Steplight family is a very large and very close-knit family. The main trait of the family seems to be the high cheekbone and the wide face. Other traits includes the very dark skin for most and the light timbre voice of the men. According to the present oldest living member of the family, Mrs. Esther Noisette, the youngest child of Prince and Emma Garrett Steplight, she remembers her father telling her that the name Steplight was given to a man whose name was Garrett, and he was a soldier in the Spanish-American War, and that this Garrett had a unique way of walking or stepping very light when he walks, thus acquiring the name Steplight. Some research was done to gather information on Negroes in the Spanish-American War, but little, if any, is ever recorded about Negroes. It was mentioned by several members of the family that the original Steplights were brought from Beaufort as slaves and sold mainly at Middleton Plantation, which supplied the smaller plantations with slaves. My research led me to believe that King's Plantation, located around the Magetz area, possibly not too far from St. Paul's AME Church, is where the Steplights were sold. At that time, according to the director of the city archives, King's Plantation extended all the way from Edisto to Rantals and included some part of James and John's Island. Many of the long hours spent in gathering information were done in our library here in Charleston, which is known all over America for its effort in maintaining and preserving genealogical records. Many thanks to the librarians who struggled many days with the very heavy books on birth records of Negroes dating back as far as the late 1700s. The most rewarding time of the entire research project was the discovery of a once lost branch of the Steplight family, who was possibly the second child of Jack Steplight. When it was learned that Gubby, or Governor, one of Hector Steplight's sons, went to Florida to live and returned many years later, and not long after died here, made mention after returning that he had a family in Florida. Then the search began. Unfortunately, I have been unable to locate Gubby's family, but I stumbled across something even bigger, and that was the Uncle Moses that was so often off and whom many had never seen. Some of the offsprings of his family are still living in Florida, and some others have made Cleveland, Ohio their home. I don't feel no ways tired. I come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road will be easy. I don't believe he brought me this far to leave me. And it says Alfonso Brown, the family historian, Charleston, South Carolina. So he gives his address and his phone number. So periodically I do see him when I go to visit Charleston. So we are very grateful that we have him as the family historian. Some of the other types of events besides a family reunion would be graduation, marriage, as we mentioned, migration, and also looking at organizations. So for example, maybe somebody has a poster or a jacket that reflects that they're in a union. So this is just a poster that I had from Raleigh. And I think the reason that I like this poster, it talks about, we support Raleigh sanitation workers' demand for justice. And it says, no forced overtime, overtime pay for volunteered overtime, make temp workers full-time and permanent, management respect and no retaliation, workers' rights are human rights. North Carolina Public Service Workers Union, UE 150, and it has the phone number. And I think that what really struck me, the reason I have it, is because it talks about the sanitation workers. And I think about the sanitation workers in Tennessee, where Martin Luther King went to see the sanitation workers, and how they had the posters that they were wearing that said, "I am a man." So that is why the sanitation workers poster just struck a chord with me. But in terms of records, it's just something that we can think about. A pen, it could be a pen. And maybe you didn't even realize a relative was a part of a union, or that they were a leader in a union, or you don't really think about it. You just hear they go to these meetings, but maybe you don't really know what that is about or really understand the significance of it. So when you're going through documents and you're finding these records, this would be very critical to learn about their history and a part of their identity, in addition to the traditional records that we talk about. Okay. And then what types? So we talked about recording, someone mentioned video. There's also the audio recordings you might have. Someone might have a recording on a cassette. How about a bank book? Freedmen's bureaus, you can get a lot of information if you go back and look at the freedmen bureaus, because they have a lot of information about the freedmen banks, especially the ones that would be done in the South. So mechanics and farmers. Have you heard of banks, for example, called mechanics and farmers? So those are examples of some of the banks that were formed to cater to black people once they were freed. So those are good sources of information. The Bible. How many people have a family tree or birth dates that are recorded in their family Bible? So that's an example. And one thing that author Howell talks about is to check the date of the Bible versus the dates that are written. So the date of the publication. So if the Bible was published after the dates that are recorded, then you'll know that people wrote the information in there based on memory. But if the Bible is older than the dates, then you know that pretty much people probably wrote the dates down, let's say as the births occurred, or the marriages occurred, or the deaths occurred. So it's more likely to be more accurate because they were writing it down as it occurred. Also the birth certificate, it will tell the name, the date, the time, the location, the parents' names. It could be something like a bookmark. Could have information about an organization that your parents belong to. A bulletin, a church bulletin, their certificates. Now with the death certificate, if someone does not like who has been designated as a beneficiary, you can have family conflicts that will start and can last forever. Anybody experience that in their family? I don't see hands going up, but I see heads nodding. Okay, so that is a very touchy situation, or someone's thinking, well, why did they leave that to them? You know, or why did they give them more? Or why did they give them the house? Or why did they leave them the land? Or give them that jewelry? And sometimes it does lead to conflicts that the family never gets over. People won't speak to each other ever again. Also, if someone dies without a will, it's referred to as a particular type of death. What type of death is that? What's the term? Intestate. Intestate. So it's like interstate without the R. So if someone dies without a will, it makes it more difficult to have it settled. And then you end up having to go through the state, and then a portion of the value of the estate can be taken because the state had to get involved because someone didn't have a will. So it's very critical to have a will and not to have a death that's called intestate, especially where property is involved, and especially when people have property in the South that they've left, that nobody's living there. People really aren't sure about the deeds, and then you've got a lot of maybe grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces, great-nieces who are trying to figure out how do they get their share of this land, which now has to be divided because it wasn't left to one person or to two people. So that is a huge issue. And land loss is really a huge issue. I think it's a shame how much land that black people have lost, in part because As the families migrated, they didn't see the value in the land, they kept associating it with hard work, and they've lost it. And it's even happening through the north. And taxes are an issue. You know, who pays the taxes? Do the taxes get divided? Do they get paid? Is there someone waiting? You know, is there a developer waiting for you not to pay the tax bill so that they can get the land? And we've had a lot of land loss. So there are a couple of organizations in the South that are trying to prevent land loss from any further than what we have, and trying to educate people and inform people about how to protect their deeds and their property, and to make sure that it is designated to beneficiaries so that the family can keep the land and see the value of the land, and not just feel like they want to sell it so they can get money that's going to go through their hands in a few weeks. Even with birth, one thing that was mentioned in the research by one of the authors, Hal, who talks about how to trace your roots. And she talks about when births occurred at home, sometimes the doctor just wrote a note. Or of course it could have been a midwife. They just wrote a note. So you won't, as you're going through documents and you're looking for your family's documents, be aware you might not see a birth certificate. If you see a piece of paper with some writing on it about somebody's birth, that is the record of the birth that the doctor filled out or the midwife filled out, because that birth occurred at home. If you want to look at the Mormons' website, the URL is www.new.familysearch.org. So it's www.new.familysearch.org. And this is the description of that database on their website. It says, it's operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is linked to the world's largest collection of genealogical resources and a global network of research centers. It contains 1 billion names from over 110 counties and territories, including those found in the 1880 United States Census, the 1881 Canadian Census, the 1881 British Census, the Ellis Island database, and the Freedmen's Bank records. The church is currently working on a massive digitization project of microfilms and other records that will bring even more billions of names into the collection over the next few years. So when I was in Michigan, I was a member of a genealogical society, and so they often talked about the Mormon database as being one of the best and most extensive databases. So you can go to that database and put in your family name, and it will give you a whole page of people who have that name or similar names, and it will tell you their birth dates, it will tell you where they appear in the census, it will tell you their death dates. So that is an excellent database to get started. I don't know when it was created, but that might be on their